The smartest people you know are quietly disappearing. Not dramatically, they just stop showing up. They used to be the ones with interesting opinions at dinner parties, the friends who asked questions that made you think, the coworkers who could see through corporate nonsense. One day, they're part of conversations, and the next day, they're just not. When you ask where they went, people shrug. They're going through some changes. They needed space. They're focusing on themselves, but nobody talks about what's really happening. Carl Jung knew what was happening. He watched it in his own life and predicted it would happen to others. He called it the necessary withdrawal. Jung discovered that when people become genuinely conscious, when they wake up to what's actually going on around them, something painful happens. They can't participate in normal society anymore. Why? Jung found that most social interactions are based on shared illusions, agreed upon stories that aren't actually true. And once you can see through these illusions, being around people who still believe them becomes unbearable. Jung uncovered 3 reasons why conscious people withdraw from society. The third reason will explain why people you care about might be pulling away from you right now. But first, you need to understand what Jung called the curse of consciousness. Because once you know what awareness actually costs, you'll never wonder again why awakened people choose solitude over society. Here's the first brutal truth Jung discovered about consciousness, why you might be losing people you care about right now. Society isn't just indifferent to awakened people, it actively hunts them down and forces them back to sleep. But the hunting isn't done by governments or institutions. It's done by the people closest to them. Jung realized that modern civilization operates like a psychological immune system. The moment someone becomes truly conscious, really awakes from the collective trance, they trigger an automatic response from everyone around them. Family members start questioning their new attitude. Friends accuse them of thinking they're better than everyone. Colleagues subtly punish them for not playing along with office politics. But Jung discovered something that explains why conscious people can't just ignore this social pressure. He found that when you wake up psychologically, you develop what he called reality vision, the ability to see what's actually happening beneath social interactions. And what you see is so disturbing that it makes normal relationships impossible. You start noticing that most conversations aren't real communication. They're unconscious people reciting scripts they learned in childhood. You see that political arguments aren't about issues. They're adults throwing psychological tantrums while calling it principles. You realize that social media isn't connecting people. It's a massive projection machine where everyone dumps their unprocessed emotional garbage onto strangers. Jung found that roughly 85% of human behavior is completely unconscious, driven by psychological forces people can't see and refuse to acknowledge. But here's what makes it unbearable for awakened people. Once you can see these unconscious patterns, you realize you're surrounded by people who are essentially sleepwalking through life while being convinced they're wide awake. The awakened person becomes like someone who can see in a world of blind people. And Jung discovered that blind people don't appreciate being told they can't see. They react with rage, rejection, and systematic attempts to convince the seeing person that they're the one who's actually blind. This creates what Jung called the consciousness trap. Stay awake and lose everyone you care about, or go back to sleep and lose yourself. Most people facing this choice don't realize there's a third option, one that Jung discovered leads to something that will change everything you think you know about human nature itself. Jung learned about this consciousness trap the most painful way possible. by living through it himself. As his awareness expanded, he began experiencing what he called psychological vertigo. He would sit in his own home, surrounded by family and colleagues, and feel like he was trapped in a nightmare where everyone was acting out roles in a play they didn't know they were performing. His wife would complain about neighbors using the exact same words and emotional patterns her mother had used. His medical colleagues would argue about treatments while unconsciously competing for status like school children. His patients would describe their problems using scripts they'd inherited from their families without realizing it. But the most devastating part wasn't seeing these patterns. It was realizing that pointing them out made him the enemy. When Jung gently suggested that someone might be repeating unconscious family patterns, they didn't thank him for the insight. They attacked him for analyzing everything and thinking he was smarter than everyone. Jung discovered that awakened people face a choice that slowly drives them insane. Participate in collective delusions while knowing they're fake, or tell the truth and watch everyone you love turn against you. He described it as living in a world of people who are convinced that 2 + 2 = 5, and they become violent when you suggest it might equal 4. The breaking point came when Jung realized that his own family and professional community weren't just unconscious. They were unconsciously committed to staying unconscious. They had a massive psychological investment in their delusions, and anyone who threatened those delusions became their enemy. Jung made a discovery that explains why conscious people don't just feel isolated, they feel like they're going insane. He found that when you can see reality clearly, while everyone around you is living in shared hallucinations, your grip on your own sanity becomes shaky. You start questioning whether you're the one who's actually crazy. This psychological torture led Jung to understand something about human nature that most people will never accept. The majority of humans don't want to wake up. They're not just asleep. They're fighting to stay asleep, and they'll destroy anyone who threatens their psychological slumber. But Jung's darkest discovery was yet to come. He realized that this resistance to consciousness isn't just personal preference. It serves a function that reveals something terrifying about how human society actually operates. What if the people disappearing have discovered something about human nature that society desperately needs to keep hidden? Jung's research into shadow integration revealed a disturbing truth that explains why awakened people can't just deal with unconscious society anymore. When you do the hard work of facing your own darkness, acknowledging your capacity for cruelty, selfishness, and evil, something unexpected happens to your perception. You develop what Jung called shadow radar. You can instantly recognize when others are projecting their unowned darkness onto scapegoats. And once you see this projection happening everywhere, you realize something that will make your stomach turn. Almost every conflict in modern society, political divisions, social media outrage, workplace drama, even family feuds, is just unconscious people violently throwing their own psychological garbage at others while calling it justice, morality, or being right. The political party you hate isn't evil. It's just the screen where you project your own unacknowledged darkness. The group you blame for society's problems isn't actually the problem. They're just convenient targets for collective shadow projection. Jung had a patient who described the horror of this realization. I used to have passionate political opinions. I was convinced the other side was destroying everything good in the world. Then I integrated my shadow and realized My political rage was just me avoiding parts of myself I didn't want to face. Now, when I watch political debates, I see people violently attacking their own reflection while calling it righteousness. I can't participate anymore because I'd be knowingly joining a mass psychosis. But Jung discovered that shadow-integrated people don't just see this projection, they feel it energetically. When you become conscious, you become hypersensitive to unconscious psychological material being projected around you. Being in environments where people constantly blame others for their inner problems feels like being assaulted by invisible psychological violence. This explains why awakened people flee social media first. Jung would have recognized it as a 24/7 shadow projection machine where millions of people dump their unprocessed psychological waste onto whoever they can find to blame. For someone who's integrated their shadow, scrolling through social media is like being forced to swim in a sewage treatment plant of human unconsciousness. Jung uncovered something even more disturbing about this shadow sensitivity. The more conscious you become, the more you can feel what he called the collective madness, a psychological epidemic that others are completely blind to. And this sensitivity reveals why awakened people aren't just uncomfortable in society. They're being systematically poisoned by it. Jung's most disturbing revelation came when he studied what happens to people who find their true selves. He discovered that once you've touched your authentic self, that real person beneath all the masks, something irreversible happens. You lose the ability to perform fake roles. But society demands nothing except performance. Jung called this persona death. Before awakening, you could unconsciously play whatever character people expected. The professional at work, the good family member at dinner, the agreeable friend in social settings. You could smile when expected, say the right things, show appropriate emotions. But once you've experienced your true self, going back to these performances feels like psychological suicide. Every workplace has unwritten rules about who you're supposed to be. Every family system assigns you a role to play. Every social circle expects you to maintain a certain image. For unconscious people, this feels normal because they don't know there's a real person underneath the performance. But for someone who's found their authentic self, these social demands become impossible torture. Jung experienced this personally, and it nearly destroyed his career. After his psychological awakening, he couldn't perform as the proper Swiss psychiatrist anymore. He couldn't pretend to agree with medical opinions he saw through. He couldn't maintain professional relationships that required him to be someone he wasn't. His colleagues thought he was having a breakdown. He was actually having a breakthrough that made their unconscious world unbearable. Jung uncovered something that explains why awakened people don't just quit jobs or end relationships. They disappear entirely. When you become authentic, you realize something terrifying about the people around you. They don't actually know you. They're in relationship with your performance, not your real self. And when you try to show them who you really are, something disturbing happens. They reject your authentic self and demand your persona back. Jung had a patient, a successful executive, who described it perfectly. I realized that my family, friends, and colleagues were all in love with a character I'd been playing. When I tried to be real with them, they acted like I was betraying them. They wanted their performer back, not the person I'd actually become. This creates what Jung called the authenticity trap. Stay fake and slowly die inside, or become real and lose everyone who can't handle your truth. Most awakened people discover there's only one way out of this trap. Jung's research revealed that this escape route comes with a price that explains the third reason why conscious people are vanishing. And this one will shatter everything you believe about human relationships. What Jung discovered next explains the physical symptoms that awakened people develop, and why they can't just toughen up and stay in society. Jung found that maintaining consciousness while surrounded by unconscious people requires massive amounts of psychological energy. But the energy cost isn't just high. It's designed to be unsustainable. Think about what a conscious person has to do every single day just to survive in normal society. They have to constantly deflect psychological projections being thrown at them. They have to maintain energetic boundaries against people who unconsciously drain others. They have to translate every authentic thought into socially acceptable language. They have to hold their inner frequency steady while being bombarded by psychological chaos. Jung called this invisible psychological labor, the exhausting work conscious people do just to exist in unconscious spaces without losing their minds. Every conversation requires you to not absorb others' emotional dysfunction. Every interaction demands you don't get pulled into unconscious drama. Every day asks you to maintain your awakened state against constant pressure to go back to sleep. For unconscious people, this isn't work at all. They're flowing with whatever psychological current surrounds them. But Jung discovered something that explains why awakened people are getting physically sick. Consciousness requires swimming upstream against a tsunami of unconsciousness. And the human nervous system wasn't designed for this constant psychological warfare. Jung began noticing a disturbing pattern in his most conscious patients. They were developing chronic fatigue, mysterious illnesses, autoimmune disorders, but medical tests showed nothing wrong. Through analysis, he realized these weren't diseases. They were symptoms of energetic depletion from trying to maintain consciousness in environments designed to destroy it. One woman, a teacher who'd spent years awakening, developed severe chronic fatigue that doctors couldn't explain. Jung helped her realize she was expending enormous energy daily just to maintain her consciousness while surrounded by unconscious colleagues and students. She wasn't sick. She was being systematically drained by unconscious people who fed off conscious energy without knowing it. When she left teaching and moved to a remote cabin, her energy returned within weeks. Not from rest, but from no longer having to defend her consciousness against constant unconscious attacks. Jung realized this energy depletion reveals something sinister about how society actually functions. Unconscious people don't just coexist with conscious people, they unconsciously feed off their energy. This discovery led Jung to his most disturbing conclusion about the mass disappearance of awakened people. They're not just protecting their consciousness, they're protecting their life force from unconscious energy vampires who don't even know they're feeding. Jung's breakthrough came when he realized this mass disappearance wasn't pathology. It was evolution following an ancient pattern. He identified the withdrawal as archetypal, something he called the hermit phase that every truly awakening person must enter. But what Jung discovered about this phase will shock you. The hermit archetype isn't about becoming antisocial or giving up on humanity. Jung found it's actually about psychological survival during the most vulnerable stage of human development. When your consciousness is transforming at a fundamental level, you become temporarily defenseless against unconscious influences that would destroy your progress. Jung realized that during individuation, the process of becoming your true self, you need complete separation from the collective unconscious, or it will pull you back into old patterns. You need silence to finally hear your authentic inner voice instead of the 1,000 voices telling you who you should be. You need solitude to integrate all the pieces of your awakening without interference from people who knew your old self. But Jung discovered something that explains why this hermit phase is becoming more necessary now than ever before. Modern society has become what he called psychologically toxic to developing consciousness. The constant stimulation, social media, collective anxiety, and mass unconsciousness create an environment where authentic selfhood simply cannot emerge. Jung himself went through profound hermit phases that saved his sanity. His years at his stone tower by the lake weren't vacation or retirement. They were psychological emergency protocol. He needed complete distance from collective consciousness to develop his individual consciousness without contamination. Jung emphasized something crucial that most people misunderstand about the hermit phase. It's not escape from responsibility. It's preparation for greater responsibility. The awakened person isn't abandoning society. They're developing capacities that society desperately needs but isn't ready to receive. During true hermit phase, your shadow integrates without social pressure to repress it. Your authentic self emerges without demands to perform personas. Inner wisdom develops without outer noise, drowning it out. The psychological transformation that needs to happen can finally complete without constant interruption from unconscious people trying to keep you asleep. One of Jung's patients, a philosopher, disappeared from academic life for 3 years. Everyone assumed he'd suffered a mental breakdown. When he returned, he'd actually experienced the most important breakthrough of his career, insights that revolutionized his field. But these insights could only emerge in complete isolation from the academic system they would eventually transform. Jung realized the hermit phase reveals something profound about consciousness development. What looks like withdrawal from the world is actually the deepest possible engagement with reality. And what appears to be abandoning humanity is actually becoming capable of truly helping it. But Jung's most hopeful discovery changes everything about how we understand the disappearing awakened. He found that the hermit phase isn't permanent exile, it's temporary transformation. The awakened don't stay gone forever. They return, but as something entirely different than what they were before. Jung mapped what he called the consciousness hero's journey. Awakened people withdraw from society, undergo profound transformation in solitude, then return with gifts that society desperately needs but couldn't access any other way. However, Jung discovered something crucial about this return that explains why most people never see it happening. The awakened don't return to mainstream society. They can't. Once you've fully individuated, you can't pretend to be unconscious again. Once you've found your authentic self, you can't live through fake personas anymore. Instead, they return to what Jung called the conscious margins, spaces where awakened consciousness can exist without compromise. You might find them as artists creating from depths most people can't access. Healers working with individuals ready for transformation. Teachers sharing wisdom with small groups of genuine seekers. Writers offering roadmaps for other disappearing souls. Guides for those beginning their own withdrawal. But they never return to the mainstream, because mainstream society would destroy what they developed in solitude. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. Patients who fully awakened rarely returned to their previous lives. Instead, they created entirely new ones, simpler, quieter, more authentic. They found ways to contribute without sacrificing the consciousness they'd fought so hard to develop. One patient, a therapist who disappeared for 2 years, returned not to traditional practice, but to working exclusively with people experiencing spiritual emergencies. She couldn't do general therapy anymore, only work with those going through what she'd experienced. Her practice was tiny but profound. She was invisible to mainstream society, but a lifeline to awakening souls. Jung realized this creates what he called parallel evolution. Awakened people aren't abandoning human civilization. They're building the foundation for its next stage. They're creating conscious pockets, alternative structures, depth communities that will support collective awakening when humanity is finally ready for it. But Jung discovered something that reveals the true purpose behind the mass disappearance of conscious people. They're not just building alternatives. They're becoming bridges between the old unconscious world and the new conscious world that's trying to be born. And this bridging function requires something from them that explains why their disappearance was always inevitable. Now Jung's complete picture becomes clear, and the 3 disturbing reasons why awakened people are disappearing will finally make sense. But what Jung discovered about these reasons reveals something about human evolution that most people aren't ready to hear. First reason, they can no longer tolerate the collective shadow projections that unconscious society creates everywhere they look. But Jung found this isn't just psychological discomfort. It's evolutionary incompatibility. Conscious people have developed beyond the psychological stage where shadow projection is tolerable. Second reason, their authentic selves cannot perform the fake personas that society demands from everyone. Jung discovered this isn't stubbornness or antisocial behavior. It's authentic selfhood, protecting itself from psychological death. Once you become real, fakeness becomes literally impossible. Third reason, the energy required to maintain consciousness while surrounded by unconscious people becomes completely unsustainable. Jung found that unconscious environments don't just drain conscious people. They systematically destroy developing consciousness through energetic vampirism that most people can't even see happening. But Jung realized these three reasons point to something that explains the real purpose behind this mass disappearance. The awakened aren't just protecting themselves. They're protecting something precious for all of humanity. They're preserving developed consciousness in spaces where it can continue growing instead of being destroyed by collective unconsciousness. Jung discovered that what looks like abandonment is actually conservation. What appears to be selfishness is actually service to human evolution. What seems like weakness is actually the wisdom to preserve what took years to develop rather than sacrifice it to social expectations. Society experiences this as devastating loss. Where did all the conscious voices go? Why are the wisest people getting quieter? Why are the awakened abandoning civilization exactly when it needs them most? But Jung found that this perspective completely misses what's actually happening. The awakened aren't abandoning humanity. They're pioneering its future. In their withdrawal, they're developing capacities that collective consciousness can't access yet. In their disappearance, they're creating spaces for others to disappear to when their time comes. In their silence, they're cultivating wisdom that the collective will desperately need but can't hear until it's ready. Jung realized that every disappearing conscious person is following the same evolutionary pattern. Withdraw when you must. Transform in isolation. Preserve what you've developed. Then contribute from the margins when the collective is ready. This isn't personal psychology. It's species-level evolution happening one consciousness at a time. If you're feeling the pull to disappear, if you've been sensing that withdrawal calling to you, Jung would want you to understand something that could change your entire relationship with this experience. You're not broken. You're not failing at life. You're not being antisocial or irresponsible. You're responding to an evolutionary imperative that's bigger than your personal psychology. Jung discovered that the urge to withdraw isn't spiritual bypassing or escapism. It's your consciousness protecting itself when it's developed beyond what your environment can support. Your psyche has recognized that staying engaged with collective unconsciousness would destroy what you've worked years to build. The withdrawal you're feeling isn't weakness, it's wisdom. You're not weak for being unable to tolerate unconsciousness anymore. Consciousness requires completely different conditions than sleep, and your nervous system is telling you the truth about what you need. You're not antisocial for wanting distance from people who demand you perform fake roles. Authenticity cannot coexist with constant performance without being destroyed. You're not selfish for protecting the consciousness you've developed. Jung found that the collective needs people who fully awakened more than it needs people who partially participate while slowly going back to sleep. Society needs depth more than surface, authenticity more than performance, developed consciousness more than unconscious conformity. Jung would tell you, let yourself disappear, not forever, but for now. Find your equivalent of his stone tower by the lake, whether that's physical solitude or psychological distance. Stop spending your precious consciousness on unconscious interactions that drain you without contributing anything meaningful. Stop performing for audiences that can't see your real self anyway. Stop translating your depth into surface terms that lose all meaning in translation. Your disappearance isn't abandonment, it's preparation. You're not leaving the collective behind. You're developing what it will eventually need when it's ready to evolve. Your withdrawal is creating space for integration that can't happen while managing constant unconscious demands. The spiritually awake are disappearing because consciousness development requires it. Not permanently, but necessarily. Not from hatred of humanity, but from love of what humanity could become. Love that says, I must become whole, even if that means being temporarily alone. Jung's final message to those feeling the call: disappear consciously. Withdraw with purpose. Use your hermit phase for deep integration, not just isolation. Trust that your disappearance is serving something larger than your personal comfort. You're not abandoning evolution. You're advancing it. Remember, your disappearance isn't the end of your story with humanity. It's the beginning of your real contribution to it. Jung discovered that every person who chooses consciousness over conformity, authenticity over performance, truth over social acceptance, makes it easier for the next person to make that same evolutionary leap. Every individual who withdraws from unconscious systems creates cracks in those systems. Every awakened person who disappears proves that living differently isn't just possible. It's necessary for consciousness development. Every conscious soul who chooses solitude over social fakeness becomes a beacon for others, ready to make the same choice. You're not walking this path alone. Even in your withdrawal, you're part of an ancient lineage of consciousness pioneers who've always had to leave the collective to preserve what they'd developed. Jung himself walked this path. Every mystic, philosopher, artist, and awakened individual throughout history has faced this same choice between collective belonging and conscious authenticity. Your withdrawal today is creating the foundation that future generations will need when collective unconsciousness becomes unbearable for them too. You're building bridges between the old world and the new world trying to be born. You're preserving developed consciousness in spaces where it can continue growing instead of being destroyed. Jung's research proved that what looks like individual psychology is actually species evolution, happening one consciousness at a time. The awakened who disappear aren't abandoning human potential. They're actualizing it in ways that collective consciousness can't access yet. If you're disappearing or feeling the call to withdraw, know this: you're not leaving humanity behind. You're pioneering where it needs to go. Your consciousness is too precious to sacrifice to unconscious demands. Your authenticity is too valuable to waste on fake performances. Your awakened awareness is too important to lose to collective sleep. Trust the withdrawal, honor the hermit phase, follow the ancient pattern that consciousness development requires. And remember, your disappearance isn't abandonment, it's evolution. The world needs evolved consciousness more than it needs unconscious participation. And sometimes, evolution requires stepping away from what is to become what's possible. You're not disappearing from life. You're disappearing into deeper life. You're not abandoning consciousness. You're advancing it. Your hermit phase isn't escape. It's preparation for whatever contribution your fully developed consciousness will eventually offer. The spiritually awake are quietly disappearing because that's exactly what awakening requires. And that's exactly what human evolution needs.